Good afternoon, welcome back. Get yourself a nice cup of tea and relax because we are travelling through time and space to 3 different destinations. The first is 1834, where Bourdonnais and McDonnell are playing their unofficial World Chess Championship match. The second destination is New York in 1859, where Paul Morphy is commentating on the 1834 match. And the final destination is the present day, where you and I are going through the games together. So without further ado, let's start the 12th game. We have d4, d5, c4, so the Queen's Gambit, which McDonnell accepts, and then e3, e5, and bishop captures on c4. Morphy says, see the first note on the 10th game between these players. So in the 10th game, we had instead the pawn captures on e5, and then an exchange of queens. Morphy says, this greatly diminished the interest of the game because of the queen exchange, and he also mentioned that bishop captures on c4 is generally recognized as the best. So Bourdonnais has improved to Morphy's liking, and the game continues with e captures on d4, e captures on d4, now knight to f6, knight to f3, and bishop to d6. And Morphy comments here, the correct move. In subsequent games, however, McDonnell almost invariably committed the error of playing the bishop to e7. But in this game he didn't. He did bishop to d6, which Morphy likes. Bourdonnais castles, McDonnell castles, and Bourdonnais plays bishop to g5, pinning the knight here. McDonnell doesn't like this, so he plays h6 to chase away the bishop, and then he still doesn't like it, so he chases away the bishop again. And Morphy comments on this. He says, McDonnell has been justly censured for his premature adoption of this move in these contests. There are, undoubtedly, many cases in which the g-pawn may be thrown forward with advantage. The move, however, should be made at the proper stage of the game. So Morphy doesn't like this. And the game continues. The bishop retreats once more all the way back to g3. Now McDonnell decides that, okay, I'm going to try the same thing. I'm going to pin this knight. But Bourdonnais ignores it. He plays knight to c3, knight to c6, queen to d3, and now McDonnell doesn't like the pin that the bishop has on the f-pawn, so he unpins by advancing his king. But Morphy says, this move enables white to obtain an advantage in position by knight to e5. Bishop captures the knight would certainly have been preferable. If, in reply, white captures with the queen, he does not appear to possess any marked advantage, and if he plays queen to g6 with check, taking advantage of the pin, then king to h8, the queen captures h6 with check, the knight blocks, the white pawn captures the bishop, and the black knight captures the pawn on d4, then black's game is quite as good as his antagonist's. So that was not played. We had instead the king advancing to g7, and we continue with knight to e5. The bishop captures, the pawn captures, now threatening the black knight. So McDonnell advances his knight to h5, and Bourdonnais says two can play at that game, and he advances his own knight to d5. McDonnell captures the bishop on g3, which evokes a response from Morphy. He says, we do not like this, but it would be difficult to select a move of any greater promise. White has the better game in consequence of black's erroneous 12th move. So the 12th move he was talking about there was the advance of the king to g7 that we went through earlier. But we do have the benefit of 21st century chess engines to say that the engine actually prefers knight to e7 here, going for the exchange of knights. This is slightly better than capturing the bishop. So they didn't have chess engines in the 19th century, so the bishop was captured by the knight and the queen captures the knight back. And this of course attacks the bishop here, which retreats to h5. However, the engine again, because Morphy's gone to sleep, he's incorrigibly lazy, as we know, the engine says this is a massive blunder. Something like bishop to e6 is less bad. But why is this a massive blunder? Well, it allows white to play queen to c3, x-raying the king through the pawn. And now, if you play something like the bishop back, you can reveal the check. You can't capture the pawn back. Maybe the best move is to block with the pawn. But now white's going to have the opportunity to line up his rooks up the centre, now x-raying the king, and the other rook's going to come across to do the same thing, and it's going to be extremely hard for black to play. He's probably going to lose the queen or a rook or something like this. So this is why the engine thinks this bishop to g5 move is a terrible blunder. So the game continues rather with f4. McDonnell ignores it and plays knight to a5, attacking the bishop. Labourdonnais defends the bishop, but McDonnell wants to capture it anyway, and the pawn recaptures on c4. McDonnell now attacks the knight with c6, but Labourdonnais doesn't want to retreat, so he goes for the outpost on f6. We have queen to d4 with check, and the king moves out of the way. McDonnell doesn't capture the c4 pawn here because his bishop is under attack, so he retreats his bishop first, and then we have rook on a to d1, and McDonnell does capture the c4 pawn. But the Bourdonnais pushes f5, attacking the bishop again. So the bishop retreats, and Le Bourdonnais doesn't capture the bishop with the knight. Instead, he advances his knight to d7. And this attacks the rook here. So the rook goes to d8, out of the way of the attack. But Le Bourdonnais keeps pushing his pawns. And in response, McDonnell decides to push his f-pawn. So this e-pawn is now a passed pawn. And also it enables Le Bourdonnais to advance his queen to c7, and now he's x-raying the king here, looking very dangerous indeed. McDonnell responds by going to c8 with his rook, but this leaves the pawn here exposed, which Le Bourdonnais now captures. We have queen to b5, maybe hoping for an exchange of queens, and Le Bourdonnais plays rook to b1. But interestingly, the engine here says the better move is knight to b6, revealing the check. And this ends up actually sacrificing the knight, but the idea here is that it enables white to mount a crushing attack with his pawns here. So if we follow this line a little bit, I'll show you what I mean. King to h8, queen to e7, and we have the pawn captures the knight, so there's the knight sacrifice. We have queen captures this pawn with check, so the king moves, and queen to f7 with check, defended by the pawn, so the king has to move again, and now we have e7. And eventually this pawn is going to be able to be pushed, and it's just going to be unstoppable, and black's just going to start losing heaps of material until he's checkmated. However, Le Bourdonnais didn't go for that. He instead, as we said, went for the rook to b1 move, and we do indeed have an exchange of queens here. And notice now that the king is still being x-rayed, but this time with the rook instead of the queen. So McDonnell moves it out of the way, but in doing so gives up his f-pawn. And he also has to deal with a double attack on the bishop. So he moves the bishop back to g8 out of the way, and Le Bourdonnais puts his other rook on the open d-file. So McDonnell challenges the d-file, and Le Bourdonnais ignores the challenge and just doubles up on the 7th rank. McDonnell goes for the rook exchange, and now McDonnell, probably from a lack of anything better to do at this point, pushes his g-pawn. It's undefended, so the knight could pick it up, but Le Bourdonnais just ignores this, and maybe Le Bourdonnais is worried about accidentally getting back rank checkmated by the remaining black rook, so he moves to g1 to relieve any worries. McDonnell pushes his a pawn 2 squares, but Le Bourdonnais ignores it and pushes his e pawn to e7. And at this point, McDonnell finally gives up, and he says, "Congratulations on winning the game" to Le Bourdonnais. "Enjoy your point." And McDonnell probably went off to his room to have a long, hard think about how he can improve his game tomorrow. And I expect Le Bourdonnais just carried on drinking into the night and played a lot more games with his new friends and gambling. So that was it. That's 7 games to 2 to Le Bourdonnais, and I look forward to you joining me next time for Game 13.